Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Lucy Hodes, Senior Vice President of Media and Communications for CCA, and I will be your host. I hope everyone is safe and in good health. Today's webinar is Accelerate the Deployment of 4G, 5G Virtualized Open RAN, sponsored by Altiostar and also featuring WWT and Cisco. We're pleased to have them as part of our Wednesday webinar series to deliver content to you, no matter where you might be working these days. We have three presenters today. First is Shabir Bagasrawala, who is head of go-to-market at Altiostar. Next is Greg Shoney, VP of Services and Strategic Solutions at Worldwide Technology. And we also have Steve Maley, who is the systems architect at Cisco. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please submit them at any time using the question function, and we will get to all the questions at the very end. Also, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the CCA website after it's over. Now, Steve, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lucy. Yes, this is Steve Maley, one of the systems architects at Cisco. Been working a lot with our partners on Open RAN and a lot of very detailed work with our partners on the call today, WWT, Worldwide Technology, and Altiostar. And I'd like to, set the landscape of this evolution that we're seeing in the RAN for 4G and 5G. And a good way to frame it is thinking about how software-driven change is finally coming to the radio access network. We've heard this term Softwarization, and we've seen it in just about every other aspect of business and enterprise conduct. Think of how many applications and services are now delivered from the cloud. And when we think of the radio access network, it's one domain of the mobile network which up until now has still been largely untouched by some of these very dramatic changes. As summarized on our simple slide here, we've seen that we've had a very proprietary hardware appliance-driven approach to the mobile access network. And now that's changing to be able to enable that to move to a flexible and disaggregated and multi-vendor approach, an architecture where it's the software-defined nature of every application that now governs and controls how it behaves. Moving from what we had closed systems where a single vendor developed and delivered proprietary hardware that stretched from the radio through to the baseband unit equipment, moving to something that's more modular, something that can be applied with intelligent automation. We get this end-to-end internet protocol connectivity. A key point to giving us more flexibility, more options in how we design and architect our RAN, giving us more choices for how we can implement different service offerings. Last key point, in the past when we talked about the RAN, it was very much defined and limited by what those monolithic vendor choices were. And now with this move to a software-driven approach, we have the option to be able to define the network and tailor it to a far greater degree for those specific services, for those specific applications, those use cases that we're seeing and that are really driving our growth in 4G and will be some of the key drivers for 5G. So if we take that the next step, we have a nice, all-encompassing architecture slide here, but it does capture some of those key transitions that we see happening. Decomposition, what used to be single element functions now being decomposed and broken down in software to separate multiple element functions, with the idea that they are enabled to be separate because of open and defined and standardized interfaces. Disaggregation, something that we're seeing in just about every other sphere within telecommunications. The separation of software from hardware, being able to take something that previously was a function performed by a dedicated piece of hardware and now separate that to be a software function, in some cases separated into separate software functions, and those software functions running on hardware that can be sourced from different vendors. The last point, the infrastructure convergence, is less of a major driver in the RAN domain. We are seeing it in every other aspect of the network. but the infrastructure convergence is related to how we have, previously we might have had a separate mobile network, separate from an enterprise network, separate from consumer network. And now, as simply illustrated in this simple graphic on the right here, we talk about multiple access networks, whether they be a radio access network, whether they be some other form of an access network, converging at some midpoint, some aggregation point in the network to be sharing a common network from that point deeper into the network, naturally bringing greater levels of efficiency, greater levels of operational scale to the networks than what we'd experienced in the past. One of the other key architecture shifts that we have coming forward now is the prevalence, the capabilities of what sometimes is referred to as edge cloud, sometimes edge data centers, far edge locations, different terminology used by different people, but all referring to this concept where in the past we had a very simplified, a centralized core, the RAN distributing out, and now we have a merging of those two separate domains. The core being distributed out to edge data centers, the RAN, elements of the RAN coming back closer into the network and in effect co-locating in some cases with those core elements in these edge cloud, these edge data center locations. All of those different architecture options enabling optimization of everything from operation to service delivery. So when we think of Open RAN for rural and regional wireless carriers, I'm sure some of the key questions that come to mind are, okay, what would this mean for a rural operator, for a regional wireless operator? What are some of the advantages that an Open RAN network would present? I've captured what came to mind as hopefully the top of mind advantages. I'm not going to say these are all of them, but this is an initial snapshot of the likely top of mind, most relevant advantages. With any rural and regional operators, there's always stringent demands on keeping those OPEX and CAPEX budgets under control as much as possible. One of the big evolutions that we see moving to effectively a cloud-based, a software-defined network is increased automation. The ability to introduce some of those cloud automation procedures and work operations into the RAN network. We see that as translating to everything from increased efficiency, from centralizing some functions that previously were distributed right out there at the radio base station sites. That centralization that makes possible increases efficiency. Other operational efficiencies just translating to fewer actual truck rolls, fewer site visits required. When you're talking about a regional and a rural network, those site visits exceptionally time consuming, exceptionally manpower intensive, greater efficiency possible with that greater degree of automation. Some of the other key points touched upon here, the ability to have more choice in vendors. A multi-vendor network is by nature the definition of being able to have options for different radio vendors, different hardware vendors. All of those options coming into play, the greater range of choice, that greater range of competition to drive better vendor management. I touched upon flexible architecture options, the ability to actually re-architect networks and place those network functions in different places in the network rather than what has been the traditional, a core separate from a RAN. And when that was the case, there were some network services that really couldn't be economically delivered or couldn't be optimized in terms of what was the best service delivered to the customer. And I'll touch upon that a little bit more on the next slide. Those flexible options, improving that service delivery, improving the economics of the operator, improving the service experience by the actual end user. And our last point, this improved global supply chain. We are talking with our partnership here with Worldwide Technology and LTO Star, US companies, US vendors, bringing real, proving, existing solutions that can be deployed at scale today. In a time of challenging supply chain issues and the like, this is something that should always be viewed as a major positive, as operators look at their RAN choices for their evolution of their 4G and into their 5G plans. So just touching a little bit further on, I just picked two leading use cases. Definitely not all the services, but two of the leading services that I imagined would be some of the key points that operators in a rural and regional area are thinking of, some of the services they'd like to bring on top of their existing mobile operations. Fixed wireless access, the ability to architect a network with multiple edge data centers, distribution and breakout, local breakout, those flexible RAM workload placement options are something that effectively changes some of the economic equations of what a fixed wireless access service could be in a rural environment, in a regional environment. So again, I'm not saying this is the only option that Open RAN enables. It's one of the many options, and it's one that definitely should be explored because there's a lot of potential and possibilities that previously were highly limited with a more stringently defined, we'll call it traditional network. Another one that I'm sure every rural operator is looking at today is the opportunity for IoT, massive machine type communications, is the buzzword that's now attached to it. This has always been very intriguing, but also very challenging because we're talking about services, whether they be for sensors, whether they be for any number of IoT type devices. They're usually low volume. They may transmit just a very small volume of data every hour, or possibly every day, or maybe every few hours. That leads to some low revenue services, and how to deal with that and make that an economic proposition has always been a major challenge, and continues to be a major challenge for operators of every scale. One of the keys to enable that is the introduction of this greater level of automation that Open RAN brings to the picture, changes the equation. It's something that we examine with our partners, and we do a lot of work with our partners such as Altiostar, such as WWT, as operators start examining what are the different options that they become available when we talk about flexible options of an Open RAN network. So here's a simple graphic to try to capture all those significant architecture changes. We've got some abbreviations here. We now have front haul abbreviation, mid haul, and back haul. As I said, we're talking about these edge and in this graphic implementing also a far edge data center, a centralized data center, all of those together being classed as what we call a telco cloud. And the key point is we're moving to this end of this era of orchestration, as highlighted up here in some of our upper levels of this graphic, where there's edge orchestration, the actual those edge and far edge data center, and the virtual elements hosted within the transport network, the orchestration of the core network, the mobility, the data center orchestration, all of that enabled within then to an end-to-end orchestration. That's part of the vision that drives this capability that Open RAN brings forward. Just to wrap things up, just wanted to mention some of the key driving forces behind this at both an industry collaboration and at the government level. The open interfaces are what the O-RAN Alliance brings forward. That's what enables us to get that decomposition, that separation into separate software elements. And that's the open interfaces, the separation of software from hardware. O-RAN is now working in many, many ways, partnering with the TIP project, the Telecom Infrastructure Project, where Telecom Infrastructure Project is working on bringing those open interfaces and enabling modularity and interoperability. O-RAN has already announced their close cooperation and collaboration with TIP. It was just recently announced, just a few days ago, O-RAN and the GSMA, the Association of Mobile Operators from around the globe, working together again to see how the two organizations in collaboration can help drive and enable the adoption of these Open RAN interfaces. And the last a key point, another recent announcement, what's called the Open RAN Coalition. This is a collection of more than 30 global technology companies coming together to work and promote adoption of government policies, those government policies geared towards the adoption and acceleration of Open RAN. So that concludes my part of the presentation. At this point, I'd like to hand it over to Shabir from Altiostar to take the next part.
So thanks, Steve. Appreciate the introduction to Open RAN. In this section, what I'd like to do is I'd like to walk our attendees through what are the different deployment models with Open RAN. So if we go into the details of this, what we'll see is that it follows the same architecture, right? So typically, what does Open RAN mean? It means that you have radios and you have your cell sites just like traditional RAN, okay? But then there is a complete transformation once you start going up the protocol stack, right? What happens is that with a virtualized RAN concept, you take your protocol stack and you virtualize it in the form of a VDU and a VCU. A VDU is typically called a distributed unit, which is very transport sensitive, and typically this is deployed at a far edge data center or at a cell site. In this slide, what I have demonstrated out here is this VDU at a far edge data center. And typically the way you have to look at the VDU is the more you pool, the better you have savings in terms of CapEx and OpEx. And there are more interesting things you can do in terms of MEC functionality or carrier aggregation or uplink comp. So there's always benefits in terms of pooling and aggregating as many VDU functions as possible. Now, as we go further up the protocol stack, right, you have this concept of a VCU, which then typically is the non-real-time functions of the RAN. And this can be aggregated in a central data center. And this typically sits side by side in a virtualized environment with your other functions, right? Like your EPC, your IMS, your PCRF. So this is really the stepping stone of how you transform from a traditional RAN network into a cloud RAN, and then from a cloud RAN to an open RAN. What you want to do is you want to create these sandboxes of virtual machines. And these sandboxes are running your different workloads, your telco workloads, in a common NFVI architecture. Now, like Steve mentioned, we have a common orchestrator, which will, be the management functions. It'll bring the automation aspect to the Cloud RAN, and then you still have your traditional OSS that you have in the telco space. So this is how you make the transformation for an Open RAN and a Cloud RAN in terms of the building blocks of a telco network. Now, like I mentioned, the VDU typically is running the lower layers, which is typically your physical layer, your MAC layer, and your RLC layer, which is very transport sensitive. And there may be certain scenarios where you don't have fiber transport everywhere. And in such a case, what you do is you deploy your VDU in typically close to the cell site, right? And this allows you to take any kind of transport which is considered as a mid-haul network to be used with this VDU. And the benefit of this architecture is that you still have the cloud-based architecture in the central operations, which allows you to pool the VCU functionality, and it also still gives you all the benefits from a cloud RAN perspective, right? Like the automation, the redundancy, the scalability. So all of that is still existent from this deployment model. So we call this the RU-DU co-located model. Now, one of the big questions is, okay, for Cloud RAN, you need these general purpose servers. Will this server be able to be deployed at the cell site? And the answer is a resounding yes, right? Because what we're doing is we're depending on x86 architecture, which allows you to use a wide portfolio of different general purpose servers. And what we're doing is we're leveraging a lot of ecosystems that are built for like the aerospace industry, for the IT industry. So as an example, we have an example of a IP65 DU, which does not need any kind of shelter at the cell site or cabinet at the cell site. It can be mounted directly on the tower. Okay. And in the last model, I have the third model, which is, let's say you need to build like a scalable solution, right? And you still want to leverage the existing cabinet that you have at the cell site. There is a wide portfolio of servers available which you can mount inside this cabinet. These are typical 19-inch wide servers that you can deploy in the cabinet. You can manage a lot of radios and bands with this kind of architecture. And then again, just to emphasize, the cloud-based architecture still exists in this deployment model. So you have the benefits of the centralized CU, the management, and the automation. And the automation, like Steve mentioned, is a very key factor in terms of the OpEx savings, right? Because all of this is running as virtualized machines or container functions. And these things allow you to bring in new software practices. It disaggregates your hardware from your software, and it allows you to really deploy and get the benefits and the promise of 5G and 4G. Okay. So now one of the questions that we get often, and now there's a lot of interesting developments with the ORAN Alliance and the Open RAN Policy Coalition. There's a lot of challenges that operators may have this perception, or there may be myths that, okay, this Open RAN is a new technology. How do I bring this into my network? There's a lot of questions that, okay, maybe this is, there's still a lot of things that we have to consider. So from that perspective, I've tried to highlight some important aspects of Open RAN. Okay, so one challenge that a lot of people think is that, okay, this is a good concept for low cost or or cheap solutions, but that's not true, right? Like the Open RAN portfolio that Altiostar is building with our partners is a very high capacity, feature rich solution at low prices. So even though low cost does not imply cheap, okay, it means that with the Open RAN ecosystem, with the benefits of this open procurement model, you will still be able to get the best of breed solutions. You will be able to spur innovation into your networks. You will be able to avoid margin stacking that is very typical in the existing networks. You still will get all these benefits, but from a software perspective, it does not imply that it is cheap or it is still in development. This Open RAN solution, we are working with tier one operators. We're working with tier one markets. We're working with rural markets. We're working with all kinds of markets, right, for all kinds of deployment models. And really, it is the concept to build a very robust features. It allows you to deploy, all the mobility scenarios, all the handovers, all the requirements to interoperate with the EPCs. So it's not compromising in terms of the quality of the product. The other question that we get from a lot of operators is, okay, so I have to take all these different vendors and I have to kludge them together. I have to put it all together myself. And the answer is no, right? The worry that a lot of operators have is that, okay, I have to operate the network and I can't spend all this time and effort to put all these different vendors together. Well, the answer to that is that Altiostar is building what we call the integrated Open RAN approach, right? What that means is that we will work with partners like Cisco and the radio vendors, be it like Airspan, KMW, Fujitsu. We will work with the whole ecosystem to not only integrate, but to certify and test and ensure that it is a complete carrier grade solution. Okay. And then the other factor that you have to consider is that when you bring this solution into your network, you're also going to significantly reduce your OpEx expenses. the automation benefits, the zero footprint architecture, the discovery, the automated discoveries, the automated commissioning, the automated healing. These are new concepts that you're going to bring into your network. It's going to require a little bit of a different approach from your operational team, but it is going to, from a long-term perspective, mean a lot of benefits and a lot of cost savings over time. And then finally, there's a big question about, okay, so is this ecosystem mature? Are there hardware solutions available today? So the way Altiostar has worked is we're working with more than 30 companies in the Open RAN ecosystem to build a very robust portfolio, right? And the robust portfolio, comes from very well-reputed companies like Cisco and Intel and WWT to build this pipeline of hardware solutions, radio solutions, transport equipment, cloud solutions, baseband. So I would say that the portfolio that you will get out of Open RAN, the roadmap that you will get out of Open RAN is going to be much larger than your traditional RAN networks. Okay, typically, when an operator goes to deploy a RAN network, there's 2 or 3 usual suspects, right, that they approach. But now, whether they want to deploy an IoT application or a fixed wireless application or a massive MIMO application, there's a lot more variety available. And because of the momentum that the industry is going through and a lot of tier 1 operators are aligning to this, there's going to be this number of companies is just going to explode. Okay. So finally, okay, what are the building blocks and how do we piece this all together, right? So, typically the transition from 4G to 5G, any new investments, any new deployments that any operator is making, I think has to now consider 5G, right? And one of the resounding requirements for 5G is cloud. Okay, the cloud is a very important aspect that if you're going to invest money today, you should be investing in networks and solutions that will allow for the migration path towards cloud. So in the slide, what I try to highlight is that there is a RAN part or a radio access part, which is represented out here. And then a lot of this radio access is going to intermingle with the cloud deployment. And very soon, operators are going to be looking at like an IT approach towards their networks, right? So they're going to start introducing central data centers, edge data centers, far edge data centers. And what they want to do is they want to introduce concepts like mobile edge computing. They want to look at transitioning their core networks into the cloud as well. And a big piece of this is looking at the RAN transition into the cloud with that. So our recommendation to most operators today for 4G and 5G is that any new investments, they have to look at building this in a modular way so that there is protection in the investment that you make. It is also important that you look at like the cloud transition that your networks need to make so that you're prepared for the 5G transition as well. Okay. And now the big question we get is, okay, there's so many pieces, there's RAN, there's cloud, there's data centers. How do we bring this all together? And this is where you have the ability to use a master system integrator that can tie this all together, right? And at this point, I'd like to hand it over to WWT, who can talk about how they can help with this transition. So Greg, on to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Shabir. Thanks to all the CCA members who have joined and others to listen in on this important topic. I think Steve did a terrific job of talking about Open RAN, the market, the benefits, and Shabir then I think brought it into what are the modular deployment models, right? So what are the benefits, but how could I possibly do this? And what I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes talking about the reference architecture that we built with Cisco and Altiostar, and really a program we put around it that we think is particularly important and relevant for a rural operator or a mid-sized operator, as well as a large carrier, to be able to take into the market. And Josh, can you hand me the ball? Okay. Well, while he's doing that, let me go ahead and just get going here. So a little bit about WWT. You know, we've been in the business for over 30 years as a master system integrator, U.S.-based, 7,000 employees, based in St. Louis. You know, a long-standing partnership with Cisco, as well as many of the largest technology providers globally, and more recently Altiostar. And you know, if you think about the types of problems we solve for service providers, both very large, here we go, mid-size and beyond, it's navigating complex technology transitions. And in the past, it's been introducing virtualization into their networks, rethinking the way that they distribute content, rethinking the way that we build wireless networks. So we've got an incredible amount of, really, I'd say, unparalleled deep domain expertise in the service provider industry. And so we look at Open RAN as really the next transition, Steve said, right? To use things like software-based disaggregation, basic principles you're seeing throughout other parts of the network into the radio access network. And, when you think about our business and what we do, I'll talk about the program here in a moment, but, think of three pillars, right? We've got our massive advanced technology center, not a lab, right? But a production center in which we can quickly stand up, replicate a customer's environment, outside of their commercial, production network in order to obviously delever, mitigate their risk. So we can figure out everything else, in the advanced technology center, replicate all aspects of what they're trying to do, tune, test. And then at that point, we've got, I think what WWT is most notably known for, our global supply chain and logistics. We operate over 4 million square feet, over three continents, the bulk of it here in the U.S., but obviously, in EMEA and beyond. And, with this comes, think of the ATC as, we can help an operator test, tune, define what we're going to deploy, then we put it together, right? We stage, we configure, we test, we QA. And the third pillar are really the services, right? In terms of how we're going to get it out to the market. What are we going to do when we get it out to the market, right? Deployment services, having people on the ground that can do, installation. So, with that, what we set out to do is take the reference blueprint we've built that is in our advanced technology center today, built on the Cisco technology, the Altiostar technology, all the modularity and flexibility you heard about, and put an enablement program around it, where, I won't take you through all this in the essence of time, but, essentially 5 steps. The first is services capabilities to help an operator around solution definition, validation, and testing. This includes POC, what does the network look like today? What are we going to have to do? What are we trying to do? Steve brought up, a couple use cases. We find each operator has a different set. And then from there, we take it into design, scoping and planning. This includes many of the things Shabir talked about in terms of how much fiber is in the environment, right? What's this going to look like in practice? And from there, we once we have it defined, design scoped, we'll stage solution build and ship, right? This is where we can leverage the big muscle that WWT has had in practice for 30 years and really helping our customers less with the technology decisions, but more the consumption. And one of the criticisms, and I think Shabir hit it head on, is, a little bit like, hey, this is all really interesting, but how in the world could we do this? And I would tell you, this is really where a master system integrator comes into play, working alongside with Cisco and Altiostar. And then it's, the feet on the street, if you will, right? It's the people in the field partnered with your organization to provide on-site deployment services optimization. And, probably the most important thing, and I think we've all learned these lessons the hard way for those of us that are operators or have been operators, what happens when the deployment guys leave, right? How am I going to support this? How am I going to grow it? How am I going to evolve it over time? And, those are the types of things we solve with ongoing support, full knock support, maintenance, et cetera. The one thing I want to note about this is as we're engaging in the market with large size, mid, and even smaller size operators, we see all flavors in terms of what is required, right? And this is meant to be a modular program. Many operators, feel like, hey, we've got 1 and 2, pretty well licked, and we need help with 3, 4, and 5. Others are, we're just at the beginning point, and we really want to work with WWT, Cisco, and Altiostar to help define the solution, right? What are the set of technologies, and then build it in the lab, look at it, before we begin to haphazardly introduce things into our production environment. So this is, meant to be a modular model. And, in the few remaining minutes, I just want to take you through. So, for example, what's behind the first step, right? Solution definition. What are the types of things that we'll solve? And, one of the most important are, what are the various deployment options, right? And a lot of this has to do with, the budgetary constraints of the operator, the size, the service area, but also what's in the network today, right? How much, which of the options that Shabir talked through, are going to make the most logical sense to, not just drive cost out of the deployment, but, provide a cohesive strategy so that, you can begin to embrace things like 5G over time. So, once we've figured this out, then we move to design, scoping, planning, staging, and beyond. But this is really important, and I think it's not dissimilar to any large technology transition. I would venture to guess many of you, are hearing from, the vendor community and others about, a pre-baked solution or, things to test. I would tell you that the best way to de-lever the risk is really to work with somebody like WWT in partnership with Cisco and Altiostar, to begin that journey. I just want to put this up. We have a obviously dedicated team of experts that can help you with that journey. I think, Lucy, these slides will be available afterwards. It's not a sales pitch. It's us saying, let's get the dialogue going and let's see, how we can help. So that being said, I really appreciate everybody's time today. And I think at this point, I'm going to hand it back to Lucy.
Great. Thank you all very much. We'll now start the Q&A portion of the webinar. Members of the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them. We've had a few already. So I'll go ahead and get started with the ones that we have. First question, what is the expected Open RAN market share in the next 3 and 5 years?
And Lucy, would you like me to pick that up?
Sure, it's open to anyone that would like to answer.
I'll jump in first, and Greg or Shabir can jump in afterwards. So very good question. Thank you for the member of the audience who came forward with that. What I will say is there's any number of industry analysts who have projections right now for the share that will go to an Open RAN architecture over the next couple of years. I don't want to try to be calling which analyst I feel has got the most accurate projection. What I did want to say is when I in my presentation, I spoke about what the work of the O-RAN Alliance is one of the key, enablers of this move. They're the ones who define these open interfaces. The O-RAN Alliance has been established and is led in all aspects by major mobile operators, tier 1 operators from around the globe. AT&T, Verizon, Deutsche Telekom from Germany, Docomo from Japan. That's just, the first grab bag of more than 30 tier one operators that are part of the key drivers to enable this. It's these major operators that want to have the ability to open their network, to implement multiple vendor open RAN infrastructure in their network. And so when I look at this and I see these industry heavyweights, in complement to that, have made public announcements about their intention for whether it be 4G, whether it be for their 5G plans, multiple industry heavyweights from Vodafone to Verizon to Telefonica and many, many others have publicly announced their intention to do large-scale deployments using Open RAN as their architecture. I look at that as saying, yes, this will be a major part. What percentage? I'll leave that to an industry analyst, but I can look at this with confidence in terms of the number of heavyweights that are backing this. I don't know if anyone else from the panel wanted to jump in.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in, Steve. The other thing that is very important for everyone to think about, right, is that how critical our mobile networks are today in today's COVID-19 environment, right? And if you consider how critical this is and how much consolidation we've had from a RAN ecosystem perspective, I think Open RAN is extremely important for all operators. And this is being recognized not only by industry organizations like O-RAN Alliance, but also the GSMA, all the tier one operators. They not only look at Open RAN as a nice to have technology, it's almost becoming a must have technology, right? Where you're introducing modularity into your networks, you're building this option to replace parts rather than the entire network when there is challenges going forward or when they're going from generation to generation. So it's extremely important that any new investments need to look at Open RAN, and it could be with different suppliers, different vendors, different system integrators, but it's an important transition for the industry.
Great, thank you. The next question, does RAN features such as massive MIMO and beamforming, can they be deployed on GPPs?
Yeah, maybe I can take this one. So the Open RAN technology, right, that Altiostar has been testing and working with a lot of operators is more than 5 years old, and we've done a significant amount of testing with different kinds of scenarios, including macros, small cells, micros, and now massive MIMO and beamforming is being considered one of the important factors for 5G. And we are right in the midst of working with multiple radio vendors to support this technology. We're going to support this for not only sub-6, but we're going to support it for millimeter wave, and we're also going to support this for LTE as well. So a lot of, a few companies are looking at massive MIMO for LTE technologies too. So yes, absolutely, this will be working with general purpose processors, and it will have all the benefits of cloud and virtualized RAN and Open RAN.
Great, thank you. We have time for just one or two more questions. So next question, Greg, this is for Greg. Successfully deploying Open RAN requires a lot of new technology, people, and processes. Is this accurate? Tell me about WTT's experience managing with these types of programs.
Yeah, so two-part. So the first part, I think navigating any new large technology transition and the complexity that goes along with that, particularly with limited resources, is a challenge. And that's the reason we've built the program, that we have. So, I think it's less of a technology problem. It's more around, how do you de-lever your risk? How do you maximize your investment and your opportunity going forward? And you don't want to do anything disruptive to your operation, right? Particularly as Shabir and Steve mentioned, in the times we're in right now, many of the operators here are running critical infrastructure. We can't afford mistakes, right? The second piece I touched on a little bit, but just to expand, when you think about WWT, we run many of the largest kind of wireless infrastructure deployments and have for 20, 30 years, right? All flavors and combinations, everything from equipment on the towers to large scale, satellite to large scale, physical networks that are supporting them. And, and then we've got not just kind of the centralized capability around staging, but as I said earlier, around testing, and then out into the field around deployment services. And we're finding, particularly with mid-sized operators, it has to be a combination of those things, right? It can't just be, I'll ship you the boxes. But around all of that, I would tell you particularly the most important is project management and controls. And then underlying that is domain expertise, right? Into what are we doing, right? Not figuring this out on the fly. I mean, this is a complex transition. If you're trying to stitch it together on your own, and I think unless you've got infinite resources, I think it is a very straightforward transition that will reap much benefit for your business and for your subscribers, both residential and business commercial. If you take the approach that we're laying out here, where you've got a reference blueprint and then we put the program around it. So obviously I could go on. I would call out to the people on the webinar would be, let's get into the dialogue and let's talk about your specific situation. So hopefully that helps, Lucy.
Great, thank you. Well, I see that we've reached our time limit for this afternoon's webinar. Would any of the presenters like to make any final closing thoughts before we close out?
Yeah, I can go.
Go ahead, Shabir.
Yeah, I was going to say that, let's, like Greg indicated, right? Let's have a dialogue. I think, almost all operators are somehow looking at Open RAN. There is dialogue about this from a government perspective, from an FCC perspective. If you'd like to get educated, you'd like to understand a little more about the technology details, you'd like to understand, have a workshop, just get in touch with us. We're happy to, spend the time with you. So Greg, go ahead.
That was it. And just, we really appreciate everyone's time. And this is a critically important topic for so many reasons. And, we would look forward to an opportunity to partnering with you on, progressing this in terms of your operation.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for the information, Steve, Greg, and Shabir. And thank you to Altiostar for sponsoring today's webinar. And we hope everyone has a fantastic afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.